Okay, so we want our next set of panelists to come up, more of the state discussion, state level discussion. And so I'll do quick introductions. Okay, I got you. Oh, it's fine, okay. I think that'll be right. I think that'll be just enough time, Dr. Phoenix. So we're doing this. This is a state panel. So we both have Maryland agencies represented at state level, and also commission. We do have a commission chair, but it's commission chair from Virginia. So thank you for being here, Dr. Phoenix. So first we have Assistant Secretary Carol Gilbert with the Maryland Department of Housing and Community Development. She heads the Division of Neighborhood Revitalization. The office is responsible for administering the majority of the department's community development and revitalization programs. Those include the Community Legacy, Strategic Demolition Fund, and Community Development Block Grant programs. Before joining the department, Carol was the Assistant Secretary, served as both a program consultant and program officer with the Goal Seeker Foundation. Did I pronounce that right? Goal Seeker, Foundation. Specializing in providing investment strategies and community development expertise to support nonprofit organizations helping communities and individuals in the Baltimore metropolitan area. Then we have Joe Griffiths. Joe is with the Maryland Department of Planning. He's the local assistance and training manager. Joe joined the department in January as manager of the local assistance and training unit and planning services. Joe was previously manager of the Community Information Outreach Division at the Loudoun County, Virginia Department of Planning and Zoning, where he oversaw outreach and support functions for the county's major planning initiatives. And then last, we have Council Chair, Dr. Janet Phoenix with the Virginia Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. Dr. Phoenix was the recipient of a 2008 Health Policy Fellowship from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Dr. Phoenix has been on several advisory committees, including the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Lead Poison Advisory Committee and the Environmental Protection Agency's Children's Health Protection Advisory Committee. She has international experience on issues around development and use of leaded gasoline, and she's also done a lot of work in the DC area, working with faith-based organizations in partnership with local health and environmental governmental agencies. So thank you, panelists. So sort of like the same setup with the last set of panelists. You can take about 5 minutes, or you can take less, because I know we have a little time issue. But it's going to give us your overview of what your agency is doing to address environmental justice. If you have a plan, how the plan is working, what are some of your current initiatives? Yep.
So should I start?
Yeah, you can start. Yes, please.
Okay. It's great to be here. And thank you, Dr. Wilson, for inviting us to the panel and to this very impressive set of topics. The Department of Housing, I'm here to represent our Secretary Holt, and also bring you greetings from Governor Hogan. It's great to be on campus. I'm a graduate of the School of Architecture and Planning some years ago. I won't say exactly what year. Some of you might not have been born in that year. But the Department of Housing, our mission is all about investing in affordable housing, single-family and rental housing, and also investing in communities that have experienced long-term disinvestment over time. And our aim is to help communities invest in their priorities for revitalization and community well-being. So I'm going to address 3 topics. I was asked to address and talk about and update you on Project CORE, which is the governor's initiative to eliminate blight in Baltimore City, and CORE stands for Creating Communities of Opportunity, Renewal, and Enterprise, creating opportunities for renewal and enterprise, But I want to address 2 important things that I think contribute to our intent to embed inclusion and equity in how we manage our programs. The first and foremost is that for a small state, we actually have a very high budget for the kinds of programs that the Department of Housing manages statewide. We, in addition to the programs that my team manages through neighborhood revitalization, we also deploy very important tools like the low-income housing tax credit that result in affordable rental housing. We also deploy the Maryland Mortgage Program, which results in affordable single-family home ownership. We deploy a range of programs that result in lead-safe housing and energy-efficient housing. And we deploy infrastructure tools so that communities have access to safe drinking water and clean water and sewer systems. Most recently, we've been asked by the governor to deploy new tools for rural broadband to make sure communities are connected to the high-speed information highway. So number one, first and foremost, our department is privileged to be managing very substantial resources for these kinds of important tools for community affordability and well-being. And in fact, the budget we're deploying in the last 4 years and this coming year, the fifth year of this administration, are the highest in the history of our department. The second way in which I believe we really embed social justice and inclusion in our programs at the department is through a program called the Sustainable Communities Area Program. And that program is what guides how we invest the $90 or so million a year that we have in state and federal funding to reinvest in your communities statewide. And what we ask local communities to do is form an inclusive group of stakeholders and develop a comprehensive strategy for reinvestment in their target areas for reinvestment. So the community itself identifies areas where disinvestment has occurred and where reinvestment is needed, and develops from the ground roots up a strategy to address that disinvestment comprehensively through housing, transportation, community amenities like parks, and through environmental remediation and improvements. That sustainable community strategies have been developed in more than 100 communities since that program was established now 7 years ago. And we're in the process now of renewing, which is a 5-year plan. Every 5 years, those strategies are renewed. And once that community has established its place as a sustainable community with a strategy, our program's investments go to address those projects that the community itself addresses as its priorities for reinvestment: housing, economic development, parks, playgrounds, the environment, etc. So those are the big picture ways I believe that our department is very committed to social justice, environmental justice, inclusion, and equity. But I want to highlight the one project that Dr. Wilson has asked us to say a little bit more about, and that is Project CORE, Creating Opportunities for Renewal and Enterprise in Baltimore City, which was established by the governor in 2016 as a vehicle for us to help Baltimore address the vacancy and vacant properties that are creating blight and leading to unsafe and situations in communities, particularly in the west side of Baltimore and on the east side of Baltimore. And the governor established a 4-year budget totaling $75 million, which was matched by more than 25% by Baltimore City. So we had essentially $100 million over 4 years to help eliminate blight, not only through demolition of excess housing units, but through also stabilization in target areas where home ownership is possible, and through a process I'll talk a little bit more about called deconstruction, which allows folks to take apart buildings, and there are more jobs because of that.
Can we come back around to the
Yeah.
deconstruction
Yes.
point?
Yes.
Because I don't want to lose, I took a lot of notes, so I'm going to have a few follow-up questions. So let's give see if we can go around, I'm going to come back to you. But thank you. Let's give Assistant Secretary a round of applause, please. And sorry about cutting you off. I'm going to kind of keep it going. Yep.
Okay, my name's Joe Griffiths. I'm the Local Assistance and Training Manager for the Maryland Department of Planning. My primary responsibility is overseeing our regional planning program. And the thing to know about the Maryland Department of Planning, unlike DHCD, we have no money, we don't provide any funding, and we're not a regulatory agency. So sometimes it's hard to figure out what we actually do. But I think the work that we do with communities and with other state agencies is vital. We work very closely with DHCD on their neighborhood revitalization programs, particularly with the Sustainable Communities Program. But we oversee a lot of the Maryland smart growth efforts, particularly the priority funding area designations. And we've also developed the Reinvest Maryland 2.0 toolkit that supports the work of neighborhood revitalization and provides local jurisdictions with the tools, resources, funding, and technical assistance to support revitalization efforts in their communities. Due to Maryland's home rule, Maryland's a home rule state, has a long legacy of localized planning supported by state resources, and our work reflects this legacy. We're the home to the State Data Center, so we have a robust set of data that is provided to state agencies and locals to help local planning efforts. A particular example would be the Maryland Department of Health's development of the Environmental Public Health Tracking Interactive Map and Tool, which we provided a lot of the upfront data for that and maintain the data for that. So that's a rich spatial repository of data in this area of work. We also assist in the development of local comprehensive and area plans, including best practices and meeting state requirements, such as the 12 visions that are statutorily required to be embodied in local comprehensive plans. We do, even though we don't have direct funding, we do help jurisdictions access funding. We oversee the Appalachian Regional Commission's office in Maryland for the 3 western counties, which provides grants in economic development, housing, and community development. We also provide direct grant assistance at the local level, helping smaller jurisdictions access funding, both state and federal. We have a particularly strong program in the Lower Eastern Shore, and just some examples of projects we've worked on are the Phillips Packing Plant, rehab and adaptive reuse in Cambridge. We work closely with the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy. That'll be a mixed-use office park, but also have food-based local economic development. We've worked extensively and will continue to work extensively, particularly in Somerset County, on Hurricane Sandy relief and adaptation efforts to address a catastrophic storm like that in the future. Also in the Lower Eastern Shore, we help provide grants, technical assistance on water, wastewater, and green infrastructure. So those are some of our programmatic efforts. Initiatives, we're currently in the public comment period for our state development plan called A Better Maryland. Actually, public comments are due by next Friday, May 17th. And that has 61 strategies. I'm not going to go over all of them now,
Yeah.
but a number of them addressed climate change adaptation and environmental sustainability. Another new initiative that we're focusing on, partnering with EPA, is that Maryland is underrepresented in Region 3 in accessing brownfield grant funds, heavily underrepresented compared to Virginia and some of our neighboring states. And EPA wants Maryland to get more assessment, remediation, and other local planning efforts. So we're working closely with counties, trying to beef up our assistance in that area. And then also, finally, a recent bill just passed to add a required housing element to comprehensive plans. A lot of comprehensive plans include housing elements now, but now it's a requirement. I think it starts in 2021. I might be off by a year. But we'll be working closely with DHC to come up with models and guidelines and other assistance for jurisdictions to address housing, both affordability of housing and also rehabbing of housing that may be contaminated or have other deleterious impacts on quality of life. So, thank you.
Cool. No, thank you. Dr. Phoenix?
Good morning. I was asked to sit on the Virginia Advisory Council on Environmental Justice in 2017 when it was established. The council was put together to really provide advice and guidance to the state, to the governor in particular, about environmental justice issues in the state. And once I came on to the council, we went through a process of choosing leadership, and I tossed my hat into the ring and was elected chair. And then, you know, we had a change in administration. Some of you may have heard of our current governor, Northam. And so we went through a process of reestablishing the council. I just received my reappointment letter last week, and so we are coming back together again. We've lost some members who are uncomfortable continuing with the council under the current state administration, but despite that, I decided to stick it out, and so we're moving forward. The issues in Virginia, I think, are really not dissimilar to the issues in Maryland. When the council came together, we tackled climate change initially because there was an executive directive, ED 11, focusing on climate change, and it was written into our articles of incorporation, if you will, that we would provide some guidance about that. So that was kind of our first shot out of the box, is focusing on climate change, despite the fact that there's controversy, I think, about the potential impacts and the approaches of dealing with climate change and what some of the results might be for communities. We next took on a pipeline issue. There's a pipeline that is planned to run through the state of Virginia, and it's running through a rural area that's populated by a lot of African American residents, and they came to us and asked us to really take a close look at the pipeline, and that was really a controversial step for us. I think it put the governor in a difficult position. The state, you know, of course, it was in the process of issuing permits for the pipeline, but the residents of the community were so articulate and compelling in the stories that they were telling. Their concerns about the compressor station that was going in next to farmland. People coming in and telling us that, you know, they'd lived in the community for years, generations, and were worried that, you know, this pipeline was coming in, that they'd expressed their concern, that they'd asked that it not be constructed, and didn't feel as if they were being heard. So we took that on, and, you know, I had to duck calls from reporters because, you know, despite the fact that we were tackling this issue, it didn't seem appropriate for me to, you know, to give interviews about it. It seemed that the community should really be the one to be telling their own story and raising their own issues rather than our council, especially since these EJ councils are limited in terms of what they can do. I mean, we're set up to be advisory bodies. A close friend and colleague, Vernice Miller-Travis, really introduced me to the notion of these state EJ councils and what they can do, and I'm trying to set an example that is similar to the example I think that she has set for how this work can go forth. But we're limited. It's an advisory group, and part of my job, I think, is to lower expectations about what we can accomplish. We can shine a light on things. You know, we can write reports. We can encourage the governor to take action, but it's really up to him or her what happens as a result of what we say. And so, you know, I don't want people to come and think that we can work miracles, because we can't. Coal and energy. In another part of the state, in the area where Portsmouth and Newport News are located, there's an African American community where a highway was put through that really divided the community, and of course continues to subject them to air pollution every time a car rolls down that highway, which is, you know, just plowed through a densely populated urban neighborhood. And so on the left side, you have homes and people kind of choking on the noxious fumes that are coming from the cars. And then on the right side, you have these stacks of coal that are being stored in order to be shipped out and used in other parts of the state. So, you know, if the nitrous oxide and particulate matter from the tailpipe doesn't get you, the coal dust will. And then in other rural parts in the southwestern part of the state, we have
Dr.
mining.
Phoenix.
I think the take-home message, I'll respond in a question later on about this, I'm sure, is that we're all fighting these same battles. They just take kind of different shapes and forms, no matter whether you live on the Virginia side or the Maryland side, or if you're in D.C. A previous speaker was talking about a concrete plant, and in a community, an urban community in D.C. that I've been working with, Buzzard Point, there are 2 concrete plants that are within 2 blocks of a low-income housing development. And so, people are choking on the concrete dust in the state of Virginia. They're choking on it in D.C. They're choking on it in Maryland, and we're all fighting these individual battles without the benefit of a concerted effort that's region-wide, which I hope that this conference and conversations that grow out of this conference can create some kind of a concerted plan, because that's what we need. We're too isolated, and we're really fighting these individual local battles that are so similar, and in some instances against companies that operate in many states. And if we could work together to address this more effectively, I think we'd get a lot further down the road. So I probably went over by several minutes.
Yeah, I think all your comments were excellent. Let's give Dr. Phoenix a round of applause. I'm gonna have to adjust, do a little bit more adjustment. So just some things I heard that y'all said, I wanted you to respond. We're gonna do a lightning response, because y'all are like me. Y'all got a lot to say, but we don't have a lot of time. So lightning response. But I appreciate the comments about. I know you'll get to Assistant Secretary. You talked more about Project Core a little bit. I think that's important. Affordable housing led issues. You may know, you may not know, there was a issue on BET, this documentary series called Finding Justice, and it talked about lead and environmental racism in Baltimore, and that was a powerful episode. People telling their stories about lead issues. So that to me is something I kind of want you to respond to. You have these programs happening, but people are still suffering, on the ground. Another thing I wanted to highlight real quick, that what I heard you say with both the core and smart growth question, not necessarily for you to answer now, but you think about how have public health officials, whether it be state agencies and also your schools of public health, Hopkins and also here, help to inform what you're doing through core, and help what you're doing, Joe, when it comes to smart growth programs. I also heard both of you mention a lot about tools. We've been working on a statewide environmental justice mapping tool. You really need to have an environmental justice tool to inform decision making. Joe, you mentioned the 61 strategies. I wonder how many of those strategies actually mention specifically environmental justice, environmental health disparities, right? You talked about the toolkits, but in the data, but I remember engaging the planning like 8 years ago, and I asked them what are your indicators for environmental justice. I think I had a conversation with Andy about this, and they didn't have any. So do you have actual indicators? And so to me, you gotta have a tool that focuses on the issue to really, address the problems we're talking about. And then this is Dr. Phoenix. The coal issue is a very important issue. The issues you raise are a very important issue. I think it's just you to reflect on how, because of the political tension that was happening in Virginia, and that kind of undercut the commission, how are you going to be able to recover to be able to have the impact that you want to have? Because you said that you want to be more conservative. And I think part of the problem with the commissions, and the reason why I said I don't like the statewide commission, is a lot of talking. It's not a lot of doing. And so, and all these commissions are actually modeled after, I think in many ways, after NEJAC, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. I'm on NEJAC. I did a lot of talking last week at NEJAC. But I feel like we're having more impact at the federal level than what the statewide and the countywide commissions are having at the more local level. So could y'all speak more to Assistant Secretary, talk more about core, but how you brought in environmental justice into that?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Wilson. The very first thing we worked on with Project Core back in the spring of 2016 was to set standards. If there was going to be demolition, it had to be done in the most safe way for the surrounding communities. And first of all, the sites that were targeted for demolition, these were sites that were requested by the communities. They weren't sites that someone swooped in and just started demolishing. There are many thousands of properties because of the city's depopulation from somewhere around its height of 900,000 now to closer to 600,000. There are unfortunately more houses than there are households. So there are many blocks that the communities that live within those places of concentrated vacancy are asking be demolished. And so the first and foremost thing we wanted to establish was a process that was absolutely the safest set of standards for demolition. And we consulted experts at Hopkins and in the city of Baltimore because they had experience in working on the east side of Baltimore through a project called the East Baltimore Development Initiative in setting such standards. And we looked at those standards and we took them even further. And I'm going to ask my colleague Sarah Llewell in the audience to show you that she's available to give you one of our brochures. But what we do prior to targeting a block for demolition is we send out information to the community that describes our standards for community safety, because the worst thing that you can do is just start blasting things, and the people who are living there are like, what is happening? Is this safe? And so we wanted to make sure that we were reaching out to the community. Not only were these sites that the overall neighborhood had already voted to have demolished, but that individuals living the closest to the sites knew what measures the state was taking to make sure that safety was foremost in our minds and in our execution. Secondly, in terms of equity, we required that contractors hire where they have openings, local residents, and we, through these materials and others, encouraged local residents to apply through their Mayor's Office of Economic Development for job openings that were funded by Project Core demolitions and deconstructions. And thirdly, one thing that arose out of this elimination of blight was the recognition that these communities were also subject to illegal dumping and littering by outside parties at a very high, terrible level. So our secretary asked us to invest with the city's DPW in turbocharging their stable of equipment, and we bought 15 all-terrain litter vehicles, which also resulted in 15 new jobs to operate those vehicles, which were purchased and available last summer. And in the first year that those vehicles have been on the street in neighborhoods picking up trash, more than 139 tons of additional trash has been collected in addition to the usual process. We were also deploying, purchasing new cameras so that the city can catch illegal dumpers, and I'm really interested in Councilperson Tavares's reference to how they, highlighted the catching of those dumpers, because that is a terrible scourge that our communities are subject to. Last but not least, within Project Core, it became apparent to us that the legacy residents, many of them were not accessing dollars that they could for weatherization, lead remediation, and basic rehab. And what we found out was that very often folks who were living in their house as homeowners didn't actually have legal title to their house, because it had been kind of handed down by the generations, but the actual process of getting legal title was expensive. It cost almost $1,000 to go through whatever the process was to get title. So we are in a process now of a new initiative called My Home, My Deed, which is giving free legal advice to lower income households so they can work with a pro bono lawyer to get the actual official title to their house, which will allow them to access grants for rehab, weatherization, and lead safety.
Cool, thank you. So Joe, just quickly, can you chime in about, what kind of environmental justice indicators is planning using, and how they're actually as a partner resource, how they're pushing that out to across the state, and then how engaged are you with the National Center for Smart Growth and making sure that that's happening as well?
Sure. I mentioned it earlier, the environmental public health tracking tool, an interactive map that we've developed, not just us in the Department of Health. I can't speak for it as directly as somebody from the Maryland Department of Health, but we provide a lot of the, primarily the demographic data that's used to support and back up the indicator data that they include in that. And it really helps jurisdictions, especially smaller ones that might not have access to their own data, hone in on areas, neighborhoods, parts of their community, or where those indicators are high, and where in their planning efforts, as they're initiating new comprehensive or localized planning, where they should focus some environmental justice efforts, and we help market that with the Maryland Department of Health. And again, we take that to our jurisdictions when they are asking us for assistance with their own localized planning. As Carol mentioned, we are highly responsive, and we consider local jurisdictions our clients. And when they come to us indicating a concern, we bring all the resources and tools to bear that we know of, and help them interpret and or utilize their own resources. What was the second part?
I'm
Sorry.
I'm not sure. It's like when I say it, it's
Okay, well,
gone.
you asked
Go
about
ahead.
indicators, and that's
Yeah,
probably our
indicators, go
number
ahead.
one.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, again, we don't make, and we don't try to, we can't enforce or implement what we might think is good planning at the local level. However, we listen and provide guidance, and if health disparities, environmental justice is addressed in that early planning efforts, we have the expertise and the resources and the data and the partnerships to say, okay, that's an issue you want to address. That's an issue maybe not just locally but also in your region, and we respond and make the connections where we best think that they can be made.
Cool, thank you. So, Dr. Phoenix, to go back to your point about this, I made a point about how could the commission kind of, what's the future of it because of this flux, but also another question, and like sort of light in response to this is, what do you see Region 3's role in helping with not just what you're doing, but across the region? Because I think Region 3 could play a big role. We had a Region 3 representative at NEJAC last week, and we talked about how Region 3, you need to have the states working more together. And I made a comment that I've been working in different states in the region and seeing these issues on the ground in communities, and it doesn't sound like there's enough for the state agencies who focus more on environmental justice, like our MDE here or your state agency, that just there's not enough communication, which is leading to these sort of gaps and cracks that we're talking about. So can you speak to those two?
So I think a region-wide approach that could be facilitated by EPA Region 3 potentially is to create a kind of a technical assistance network. I think what would be useful, and this is something I've kind of thought that I've had for many, many years, is a way for people who are confronting an issue, either at the local level or the state level, to have access to people who've dealt with a similar issue in the past, so that the strategies and the lessons that we've learned can really begin to spread and disseminate to people, who feel like they're working in isolation. I think what was really compelling for our council when the Buckingham folks came and talked to us was, how they felt that they were on their own, struggling against this pipeline. Folks came in from Pennsylvania who talked about their experience with the pipeline. I'll never forget one gentleman came in who, with a bottle of water that he had collected from his well, and it was so turbid and brown, that it just really brought home the message that this is something that communities all along that pipeline were struggling with. And it was very powerful for the people in Buckingham because they felt that they had allies. And again, the role of these councils, I think, is to help shed a light on and lend some legitimacy to using this environmental justice frame as we focus on these issues. The gentleman to my right was talking about planning. We really planned our way into these circumstances through the use of zoning, through the permitting process. There's a systematic pattern that I see whenever I travel and talk to people in other communities. I see these patterns playing out over and over again. You can look at a map, and you can pinpoint on that map where the communities that we term environmental justice communities are, because that's where all of the noxious facilities are. And this pattern just plays out over and over again. But we can also plan our way out of this by recognizing the patterns, by educating people about the need to ensure that all communities and all children have an opportunity to live in a safe place, and in an environment that promotes their health instead of harms their health. That's a fundamental right that everyone has. Dr. Wilson was talking earlier about, this epigenetic issue, which really, it touches my heart, because I work mostly day to day on children with asthma. And we're seeing these connections with the grandparents' exposure to respiratory, inhaled toxins, and the effect that that has not only on their children, but on their children's children. And, and we noticed it with tobacco studies, and we noticed that grandparents who smoked had kids who were more prone to develop respiratory disease. So obviously, if it was the grandparents, it couldn't be kind of a direct effect. You weren't passing it through the womb, because grandparents don't have wombs, granddads anyway. And so we are seeing these effects of inhaled toxins, that it's a legacy of the pollution and the inequities that the previous generations have experienced, that is being passed down to the children. And we need to interrupt that pathway of exposure, and acknowledge that fact through these councils, through grassroots actions, through legislative approaches. We have to use all of these mechanisms to ensure that this gets turned around. I'm going to apologize, because I'm going to cut out, but I'm going to leave my colleagues from the state of Maryland here to continue to focus on the Maryland issues. I have a commitment that I couldn't get out of. I apologize.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
So closing thoughts from our Assistant Secretary and also from Joe. Can you just like a minute give your closing thoughts about what the future plans are moving forward with making sure that your agencies are integrating environmental justice and integrating equity into your efforts?
Thank you again, Dr. Wilson. I think we are strongly committed to authentic community engagement that represents authentically local communities, so that their reinvestment strategies reflect their real priorities. So we're just going to continue to do that. One thing through our Sustainable Communities Initiative that we are looking at is how the issue of community health, and as your conference addresses health disparities, how we really need to connect community development and community health. How can we help communities invest in the physical and open space environments that promote community health and lead to fewer and no disparities between majority and minority communities. So I think community health and community engagement, authentic community engagement, as reflected in our sustainable community plans, is very important to our department.
Okay, thank you.
So somebody with a stop sign is walking up here, so all I will say
I appreciate that.
is that
Go ahead.
I think, and I deal with, we have a very diverse, and our department's very diverse and does a lot of different things, and I would be doing an injustice to all my colleagues if I said everything that they are doing or will be doing. But I know specifically on my side, what we see as the big opportunities are, because we're not going to be getting funding and we're not going to be regulating anytime soon. So one I see as education, developing our educational resources is one of the next big steps for us, helping communities identify, as we mentioned earlier, indicators, but specific decisions that they've made in the past, be it zoning, planning, infrastructure investments, capital investments that have led to a state of environmental injustice and health disparities that we're here discussing today, and that have such a long and unfortunate legacy. So that education and those resources that can be applied locally, and not just the resources themselves and we let somebody go and use it, but we set up a system where we can help educate them how to use these resources and build local capacity. The second thing, and this is going to be a big aspect of the A Better Maryland plan, is there's a strong yearning that we've found in the state for more regional planning and regional collaboration, and environmental impacts, be it from contaminants or just from the many water resources we have in Maryland, definitely transcend county decision-making, transcend local decision-making, and they really involve a regional approach. And I see that as the next area for not just our department, but for state agencies and regional groups to focus these efforts and look at it more broadly.
Cool. Thank you. Let's thank our panelists.